Hello and welcome to lecture number 5. Today's topic will be federalism. Now, federalism can be kind of a difficult concept to think about, but let's start with just something like speed limits. Some states have a speed limit that might only get up to 70 miles an hour, others 80, 85. Well, look at this speed limit sign from the 1990s. Different states can have different speed limits because of federalism. Here's a one-sentence definition of federalism. It's a system of government where the power is divided between the national government and state and local governments. See, state and local governments can decide some issues, and the national government can decide others. Maybe this visual aid can help. There are certain jobs and responsibilities of the national government in Washington, D.C. The state government, for us in Michigan, well, Lansing is our state capital, and I happen to live in Hamlin Township. There are certain regulations at the local level. By the way, of these three, it's actually the state government that impacts our lives the most on a day-to-day basis. Now that we've defined federalism, I'd like to show some examples of how it works, and we'll begin with how federalism shapes state-to-state relations. State-to-state relations are governed by a provision in the Constitution called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. First, I want to start with the meaning. Essentially, states are required to respect the public acts and records of other states. Below that, here you see a direct quote from the Constitution. We'll try to offer some examples next. Okay, here again, we've got that full faith and credit clause and its meaning here on the right. Well, let me give you some examples of how states respect the public acts of other states. Birth certificates, driver's licenses, arrest warrants are often respected by each state. For example, if I was to drive from Michigan to Indiana, I don't have to go to the DMV in Indiana to be recognized as a licensed driver. Something else is also governed by the Full Faith and Credit Clause, and it impacted my life June 19th, 1993. That was the day I got married. I was married in Washington State. Well, I didn't have to get married again when I moved to Michigan for Michigan to recognize my marriage. Okay, so state-to-state relations are governed by that Full Faith and Credit Clause. Well, we also see that the national government has an awful lot of power as well. We'll see how that comes into play next. All right, so there are two provisions that ensure that the national government is strong. The first of these is the Necessary and Proper Clause. It comes from a provision in the Constitution, which declares that Congress has the power to, quote, make all laws necessary and proper to carry out its functions, to do its job. Let's offer some examples here. All right, there are a range of functions or jobs that Congress fulfills. Very specifically, the Constitution says Congress has the job of borrowing money, regulating commerce, coining money, declaring war. It also says that Congress has the ability to raise and support armies. But it doesn't say anything at all in the Constitution about a draft. Could you force people to serve in the military? Well, under this Necessary and Proper Clause, in order to properly raise and support armies, Congress has implemented a draft in the past. It's allowed because of this Necessary and Proper Clause. So again, I just thought I would show this again. A strong national government is protected by this Necessary and Proper Clause, a clause taken right from the Constitution. But there's another provision as well. Another provision in the Constitution is the Supremacy Clause. This ensures that laws or treaties made by the United States shall be, quote, the supreme law of the land. Essentially, if there's a conflict between a state law and a national government law, the national government wins. Now, this is going to lead, it has led, and it's going to lead to additional conflict between the states and the national government because marijuana is determined to be illegal. It's prohibited by the national government. That's what the national government says. Yet, we have 33 states that have legalized either medical or recreational marijuana, and 11 states have legalized recreational marijuana, plus Washington, D.C. And so I see this as a conflict between the national government and the states that will come to a head at some point in the future. We don't have a conclusion yet, but it's an interesting legal concept and conflict. So far, we've explored state-to-state relations and the national government's power. Now, I want to explore states' rights and federalism. States' rights are protected by the 10th Amendment. Often this is referred to as the reserved clause, because essentially the 10th Amendment says that all powers for the government are reserved to the states, except, first, powers specifically given or granted to the national government by the Constitution, and these are things like the national government coins money, declares war, and regulates trade. The other thing that's not reserved for the states are the powers specifically prohibited, or the Constitution says states can't do these things. For example, states cannot sign treaties, engage in war, or grant titles of nobility. In all other cases, all governmental power is supposed to be reserved to the states. So this actually creates quite a potential for conflict. A strong national government is protected by the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause, and states' rights are protected by the 10th Amendment. If there's a conflict between those two, well, the solution has to be decided by our courts. So far, we've explored how the Constitution addresses federalism. Now, I'd like to look at past history, and particularly the 20th century and the 1930s, beginning with the 1930s. Throughout the 20th century, the national government has grown in size and power. If you look back at this circled area here in 1900, the national government provided very few direct benefits to the American people. But over the years, you can see that benefits increased dramatically. There's a lot more that the national government does today than it did over 100 years ago. Why was this? Why did this happen? When did this change come about? Well, in the 1930s, we experienced as a nation the Great Depression. The unemployment rate nationally was 33%. In Michigan, it was 46%. Nearly half of the population who wanted to work couldn't get a job. Local governments begged the national government for help, and a president had a solution to this aid that was requested by the state and local governments. That president was Franklin Roosevelt, and he promised the American people a New Deal. There were numerous programs included in Roosevelt's New Deal. I want to focus on two. One would be the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the other was Social Security. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, was one of Franklin Roosevelt's favorite programs. First of all, it put men to work, and it helped the environment at the same time. There were numerous types of programs included in this project. They planted trees, built campgrounds, hiking trails, stocked fish in local reservoirs, or in local streams, I should say. You didn't get rich if you had a job in the CCC. Your average pay was about $35 a month, but at least you had a roof over your head and 3 square meals. There's a great historical marker that outlines a lot of the accomplishments of the CCC off of M55 in between Manistee and Cadillac. There were 57 camps in the state of Michigan for the CCC, where they employed nearly 95,000 people, planted 485 million trees, stocked over 150 million fish. It was a great program for the state of Michigan. The legacy of the CCC is still seen today. Does this building look familiar to you? Well, it's located at Ludington State Park. Here we see another legacy of the CCC. This one's from Manistee. The Orchard Beach State Park and Ludington State Park continue to generate revenue for Manistee and Ludington today, and those were first put into place as New Deal programs that still benefit our area where we live. One of the best known programs of the New Deal was the Social Security Act. This had 3 main provisions. First, it established unemployment insurance for the very first time in American history. This was funded by a tax paid for by businesses or employers. Second, it had a so-called aid to dependence clause. There were people in our society who could not get ahead on their own. Maybe they were blind, disabled, maybe they were orphaned, and so the federal government agreed that it would take care of part of its citizenry. Lastly, there was an old age pension plan funded by a tax paid for by employers and employees. The New Deal was a crucial program, and it transformed the relationship between the American people and the United States government. Essentially, it established a safety net below which the American people would not be allowed to fall through the cracks anymore. The last topic I'd like to explore with federalism in the 20th century would be elections. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but states really have a great deal of control over our elections. The national government does establish some standards, but really they're run by the states, and the states have the most influence over how the elections are run, really on a kind of a day-to-day basis. That's actually reflected by the so-called patchwork of different voting methods in each state. Some states have optical scan. That's like where you fill out a Scantron sheet. Some vote strictly by mail. Some are recorded by machines. Some areas, in some states, you've got some ballots that are hand counted and some that are counted by machines. Really, we have a ton of different methods for voting throughout the United States today. Back several years ago, there were even more types of voting methods. Punch cards were really popular, lever machines, things like that, but they were moving towards some optical scan. I just wanted to show this as well. Some of these different methods led to some problems in an election in 2000. As I say, there were some logistical problems with the 2000 presidential election. This was the election between George W. Bush, who had been the governor of Texas, and Al Gore, who had been the vice president. These dealt with so-called hanging Chad and the butterfly ballot. I'll try to explain how this worked. The arrow here is pointing to a ballot that was used in a county, in one of Florida's counties in the 2000 election. You would place that ballot into a machine, and then you would poke a hole next to the name of the person that you wanted to vote for. A Chad is a little piece of paper that gets poked out or punched out in that ballot, which is next to the name of the person that you voted for. Well, here you see an elections official who is trying to determine, well, maybe the hole didn't get poked out the whole way, and so he's trying to determine if someone actually did or did not vote for one of the candidates. Yeah, he was using a magnifying glass. There was something else in Florida as well. This was the butterfly ballot. There were so many people who qualified to get their names on the ballot that they had names on both sides of the ballot. So let's just pretend you were a Republican. And you see the ballot and you say, oh, okay, I'm a Republican. I want to vote for George W. Bush. So you poke the first hole. And then you say, okay, another person comes in, they're a Democrat. And they say, oh, well, I see Al Gore's name is the second. I want to vote for him. So they poked the second hole. Well, maybe they realized, oh, gosh, darn it, I was supposed to poke the third hole. If you vote for two people in the same ballot, your ballot gets thrown out. It also turns out that a lot of people accidentally voted for the Reform Party candidate, and his name was Pat Buchanan. Don't worry about the specific numbers on this slide, but I just wanted to point something out. The 2000 presidential election was incredibly close. George W. Bush won by a mere 537 votes out of about 100 million votes by the American people overall. Going back, as a result of the confusion caused by that butterfly ballot, officials realized over 5,000 people voted for Al Gore and Pat Buchanan, so their ballots were thrown out. 1,600 people voted for George W. Bush and Pat Buchanan. Nearly 3,000 voted for Al Gore, and the socialist candidate. Again, if you vote for two people for the same position, your ballot gets thrown out. 3,400 people voted for Pat Buchanan. He did better in Palm Beach County than any other county in the state of Florida. Probably due to voter confusion. Again, I just wanted to show this ballot once again without any of the circles and the arrows and things like that, just because it created so much confusion. It really, yeah, it led to some problems. So was that butterfly ballot a Republican attempt to confuse voters and get George W. Bush into the White House? No. It was actually designed by this woman here. Her name was Teresa Laporte, and she was a Democrat. She received death threats from people. She tried to make it easier, and it didn't work. There were lots of jokes that went around about Florida voters, and so one of them is shown here. They wanted to have an education plan so that Florida voters would not make the same mistake again, and you see what some people thought was a funny joke. Anyway. So we're just about at the end. I just had some final things to think of when it comes to federalism. So what you want to be able to do after viewing this lecture is to be able to define what federalism means, and then to explain and evaluate how it works. The foundation or the basis for state-to-state relations, the basis for a strong national government, and a basis for states' rights. Those are the key concepts for today's lecture. Well, that's all for today. I hope you learned something new, and I will see everybody online. Have a great day.